Buckner. I am the editor-in-chief of the Northern Review. We're the student media outlet for Ohio Northern University. Tonight we are excited to bring you the debate between the college Republicans and the college Democrats. Tonight we have on the docket, we're talking about guns, affirmative action, and transgender in sports. So for our first two people, will AJ and Alexa please come up? Thank you guys for being here. Question is, how should firearms be regulated in the United States?
So, I don't think there should be a whole lot of regulation on firearms. I think it should be very limited. The way I was always brought up was, if the government owns it, we should be allowed to own it. As the reason that Second Amendment was made, and pretty much what caused us to win the revolution. And I know a lot what that is too, is a lot of people say that was muskets at the time. That's nothing, but that was the tech of the time. This is the technology of the modern day. And that is what that amendment is there to protect and keep us free from a tyrannical government.
So, I think that firearms should be more heavily regulated than they are at the moment. Specifically, there are 4 regulations that I think would be very effective in stopping gun violence in the United States. So, gun violence in the United States is a very unique issue among developed countries around the world. If you take, for example, countries such as Canada or the United Kingdom, they have much lower rates of gun violence than the United States, and even adjusted for population, it's less. I know an argument is that places like England and Wales have much lower populations. It makes sense they have less gun violence. But the United States has 6 times the population and 160 times the amount of gun violence than places like that. And even countries like Canada that are very culturally similar to the United States have much less gun violence. And so there seems to be a common issue here, that we have very lax gun laws. So the four regulations that I think would be effective in lowering gun violence while also respecting gun owners in the Second Amendment are universal background checks, assault weapon and large capacity magazine bans with exceptions, waiting periods, and required training or licensing. These 4 things working together would help allow gun owners to be able to have firearms and use them to their own discretion, if that is self-defense, if that's for their own enjoyment, but it also will protect the general population from gun violence that they are being subjected to because of how easy it is to access guns. And so those are the 4 regulations that we think should be present in our legislation to tackle gun violence.
All right, now that we've had our opening statements, we'll go on to just the discussion. Do you guys have anything that you want to specifically talk about with each other? Go on. Still the same point.
Yeah, I know. I'm like humming to myself. Trying to think of good questions. I'm really not good at asking questions, but so I completely understand wanting to own firearms. I grew up in a household, like my father is a police officer. It's something I grew up around. And I understand the need for self-defense or even the argument against a tyrannical government. I think we see it nowadays with the police force being able to really shut down protests, and what happens if we as the people need to fight back against a force like that. However, we do see that the United States has more mass shootings than any other developed country, and most of them are committed by assault weapons or weapons fitted with large capacity magazines, which also increase fatalities by 60% when they're used in events like that. So how would you suggest that we address these types of issues if it isn't limiting guns?
Well, the first question is, what are you classifying as an assault weapon?
So assault weapons, I think the most general definition are they hold more than 10 rounds, and I think there's also a classification on how fast they can fire those rounds, and that's what makes them much more dangerous than, say, a handgun or a shotgun. And so assault weapons would fall under weapons that hold a certain amount of bullets and can fire them at a certain speed, and that's also why large capacity magazines are usually fit under those bans, because people are concerned about how many how many bullets are being let off in a shorter period of time, and that's what also makes it dangerous.
So, if that's the case, then that rules out quite a bit. Any semi-automatic is one trigger pull, one round is fired. It is more dangerous to have a shotgun with double 32 caliber, two pulls, you've now fired out 24 rounds of 32 cal. Bigger than any AR round that's going to be shot, bigger than quite a bit. And so really it's not the assault weapon that's per se the issue. It is more what is actually being, like, I'm trying to think of what it means here. It's more what is specifically. If you're talking about a fully automatic weapon, the way to get that is a lot harder to get it legally than anything else. I mean, obviously there's always illegal ways of getting around stuff that we've seen, but to get say a fully automatic, you have to pay a yearly tax stamp on it. I think it's about $500. You have to go through a Class 3 FFL, which is very hard to get. I know I've looked at doing it, and it's not the easiest in the world. There's a lot of background checks and everything, and that goes with almost any major modifications. If you want to have suppressors, and that's not a one stamp covers everything. That is, okay, you want a fully automatic, you have to pay for that. You want a suppressor, you have to pay for that. And that goes to each individual piece. So in the high capacity, personally, I like it when I go to shoot. I like only having to reload so many mags instead of having, oh, I got to take my 10 rounds out, I got to take 100 of them, or 10 of them, just if I want to fire 100 rounds, where I can just take 3 magazines with me. It's a lot easier to go to a range, reload, and I know I have all of that with me and I'm good.
Yeah, that's why I'd like to clarify that an assault weapon ban that we would support would have exceptions for people that can pass those kinds of background checks and get that type of licensing. One thing I want to mention is that we had a federal assault weapons ban in the past that ran for 10 years, and there were actually a few studies ran by researchers at Northwestern and the University of Florida that found that the ban prevented around 30 mass shootings from occurring within that period, and would have banned more if it stayed in effect. So I guess my question for you is, like, how would you, if that was so effective and there were still abilities for people to have weapons like that, it just was a lot harder, then what other solution would you propose other than that, considering that was effective?
I think it also, well, do you know where that study was done? Like what areas specifically? It was on a national level?
So the way the study was run was they used it was like linear regression model running with like a counterfactual where the ban wasn't in place and how many mass shootings would have occurred, and then ran it where the ban clearly was in place, and they found that it was around 30. I know it was they looked at like the data of like nationally of gun violence that had occurred, so it wasn't in a specific state.
Okay. So I know specifically there is often more gun violence in the heavy populated areas, your Chicago's, New York's, LA's, but then you go out to your rural middle of nowhere where everyone's got one, come knocking, and you don't hear about it a whole lot. Maybe the occasional something,
Yeah.
but so I think really, I don't think an assault weapons ban is necessarily the right way to go. I think there's a lot better solutions, whether there is some kind of training or something else, but I don't think a full-out ban is the right way to go.
Yeah, that's one thing that we had definitely identified in our research. That's why we had said there could be an exception when we looked at universal background checks, waiting periods, and licensing. It seemed that those three in conjunction would kind of pick up for the slack that not having an assault weapons ban would have, because background checks would close the private seller loophole and also slow down the illegal gun market, and so would waiting periods. And so those things would help stop people from being able to illegally get these guns, or at least slow the rate at which people are able to access those. So I just have a question then about like universal background checks. So they're pretty widely supported. Studies at like Harvard and other universities found about 80 to 90% support among Americans. And I was just wondering what your opinion on something like that would be.
I don't think it's necessarily a bad. Now, when you say universal, you mean entirety of them, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. The one issue I have with it, when you're doing it, you have to look at what was the crime. If somebody's going on and they're getting charged with some kind of crime that was, say, white collar, something like money laundering, or along those lines, I don't think that's necessarily an issue. But if it is a history of violent crimes or some type of physical altercation like that, I think yes, that is part of the issue. But then, on the flip side of the coin, why are those people being allowed back out too? I think it starts to have a role on that. If we know this person has multiple assault charges or XYZ violent convictions, why are they being let back out?
That is true. The failures of our prison system might be a different conversation.
You're definitely right on that. That does have very much of a different
Yeah.
effect. So something I've heard brought up that I'm definitely not opposed to is the talk of raising the limit of buying firearms to 21, which I'm not 100% know how I feel about that yet. But the other talk of it is that also raises every other adult age to 21, where convicted as an adult at 21, serve at 21, legal buy firearms at 21, and obviously alcohol and tobacco, which already has that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing, like that it could affect everything else. That's something I looked into was like age minimums, but the thing is, most gun violence that is that like people take part in is usually I think between the ages of like 18 and 34, and so there is that like younger people are more likely to commit gun violence. However, age requirements, the one difficulty you have with those, where I'll like agree with you on, is that it's really difficult when you have parents that give kids access to guns. If you take, for example, like the Oxford shooter, so his parents gave him access to a gun at 16 that he then used to kill his classmates. So I think having age minimum is beneficial, but I think it has to work in conjunction with other laws in order to be truly effective, and that's what we want. We want things that are going to be effective in law.
Yeah, and I think part of that falls back onto parents. That is a parenting screw. I mean, I've been around firearms since I was 6, 7 years old. I grew up my whole life knowing how to shoot, and I think that is a parenting thing. And I was out there with my dad every time I shot. And taught from a very young age. Now he was ex-training, ex-law enforcement, so he does have a lot of that background in the proper way. I think it's big what's going on with parents.
I agree with you on that.
We have a half an hour.
I feel like we are just agreeing on a lot of things I didn't expect us to find a common ground on. I think, personally for me, what I've seen with people who don't always support gun control is that they see it as a means to take away all guns, and I think people need to do a much better job of explaining what they mean when they say gun control, because I personally don't think it means getting rid of all guns. I think it means regulating them so that they are less often falling in the hands of people that want to commit crimes with them, and I think that's something that all Americans can agree on.
I mean, I don't see anybody saying something wrong with
Yeah.
that. It's hard for someone to stop.
No, I completely get that. my question then would be, there are a lot of common types of gun control that are discussed. What are a few that you are most opposed to?
I mean, a lot of the red flag law stuff, I think it's kind of like, it's over the top. There's too much of that within stuff. And I think just outright banning something is not, you can't be doing that. It's going to go back on my original point. If the government owns it, why can't it? Now, obviously, money-wise, yeah, that's something I think we can all relate to being in college. But if they have the chance to purchase something, I should be allowed to too. And that's one of my big things.
That makes sense.
How does your opinions on gun control and things like that inform your opinions on managing the issues that we see with school shootings and mass shootings in general? Brought up the topic.
I think growing up in the age where it's become prominent, where it's something we've all lived through, it's definitely informed how I feel about the topic. I distinctly remember after the Parkland shooting in Florida coming to school and all my teachers starting class with hey, if this ever happens, here are the exits in the room, here are things you use as a weapon. And my one science teacher was like, I need to make sure you guys get out first. And it was just like the worst day of school ever. And I think that's definitely influenced how I feel about the whole thing, knowing that this is something that's real and having friends that have gone through it as well. And that's why I am such like a big proponent of universal background checks and more restrictions on people getting access to assault weapons, because those are the weapons that are mostly used in mass shooting and school shooting events, especially large capacity magazines. And I think that that's why I'm
So, receipt question. I zoned out listening to her.
Yeah. So the question was, because of you guys are having agreements on what you think should happen in regards to background checks and things like that, to regulate guns, how do your opinions on that inform your opinions on things like school shootings and mass shootings?
So, from how I am on it, I think more armed is gonna keep people. I know, growing up, my brother, he never really heard it wasn't a thing. And now he's a good chunk older than me, but it wasn't a thing. And even when my dad he went to high school back in the 80s, that wasn't a thing. And most of the time, just about every truck in the parking lot had a shotgun in it, because they were either going hunting before or after school, and they never heard of it. I know there's a story from back in the 70s. Somebody called in a bomb threat or a shooting threat, and what the kids did was they took rotations, went out to their trucks, got their guns hunting in the morning, and they took shifts working doors. If somebody was going to try and come in, that wasn't going to happen. And I think that's part of it that falls back onto it is, if we're more regulated, something's not going to happen. Or not more regulated, more open, something is not going to happen.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from on that. But the first thing I think of when you mention that are studies I found that show that having a gun in your home increases the likelihood of there being like a fatality within the home and there being deaths. And that can be through accidental shootings, that can be through somebody stealing the gun, that can be through someone getting a hold of it and using it to commit suicide. And so I think there's like a valid argument to be made that sometimes you're kind of hinting like army teachers, like that type of thing. Like that's not exactly what you're saying, but I'm saying like it could, like that's kind of like a part of the argument. It's not what you're saying, but it is like part of the argument. And that can be a little bit problematic. I think that there's also a bit of a divide here between like clearly growing up in a more rural area, and I grew up in a very suburban area where that wasn't normal for kids to be going out hunting before and after school and things like that. I think it's also just a difference of where you're at in the country and the culture that's associated with that. Because I know there were school shooting threats at schools in my district, and I actually don't live that far from Oxford. That was like, I don't know, that was something I like my dad responded to that, so I know like that was pretty personal to me. And I know that when the police responded to that shooting, they still waited before going in because of the kind of weapon that the shooter had. And if the police aren't even capable of stopping the shooter with the weapons they have, then how are teachers who are not trained at the same level law enforcement are, or individuals that possibly don't have that training going to be capable of policing? And that's kind of,
I think that one of the big things I've seen is having a trained officer on site at all times. Well, trained and on, very much. But I think it's got to be, if you want those teachers to have it, then they need to be gone through the training. I know there's quite a bit of class stuff that Ohio does offer as a state, being that my dad's taught a lot of it. I know there is a lot of option for it. So I'm not 100% sold on the whole teacher thing. I think that's going to come down to certain situations. And even growing up in my area, I mean, I was 15, maybe 20 minutes at most outside Toledo, and I didn't see a whole lot of it. And I've seen an officer shot and killed right in front of me in Toledo, and wasn't armed at the time. I was a little too young for that, but it's, I still think a lot of it comes down to how people were raised. I mean, if you look at it today, there's a lot more single parent homes. There's a lot less families being together, and I think that causes a lot more issues. Kids aren't being brought up the right way to be respectable and to know right from wrong and be able to choose the right thing. Hey, probably shouldn't do this. This isn't the right thing to do.
yeah, I think, especially when it comes to guns, there's like the broader issue, especially with like mental health and stuff. However, I do think there's an avenue that we can take that involves gun regulations that's also successful.
I do think so. And I know, I mean, I knew where it was at. I know you don't have to touch it. But that's, I think there probably could be some kind of lock box per se or something like that. I know there is ways of doing that. It's how far are we going to go to, yes, we want to keep it safe, keep it out of the wrong hands. But at the same time, when something goes down in the middle of the night, you got to be ready to go.
I understand that. I think that's important. I also think it's important to look at statistics of home break-ins and that it's not as common as you might think, and that also possibly with training with safe storage, one thing that I found when I was looking into it was that a lot of people that went through training in safe storage, there was a study done and it had like a few different trainings and then people, a group that didn't receive any training, and one group that received like one specific type of like more in-depth training, they were more likely afterwards to safely store their firearms. So maybe the solution isn't from a policy perspective, but from an educational perspective, and making sure that people who want to own guns are educated on how to properly store them and how to use them. So I think there's a way of going around this that doesn't have to be just a policy solution, but can also be a solution from like an educational perspective or area.
And I do think education is different. It is. It's, I mean, Thomas Jefferson said, an educated and armed society is a free society. And I think that goes back onto a lot of it. If the people know how to do something and they know how to handle, we will stay as a whole, complete country, and we'll be able to work together into things. And I think that speaks a lot. But it makes coming down to people have to know.
And with that, that is the end of our portion on guns. I'd like to thank AJ and Alexa for being out here for this. Our next topic will be affirmative action. So please welcome Jacob Ashley and Allison. Yes. Rangheiser to the stage. Thank you. One question plays a factor in college admissions?
Considering race in college admissions is not as simple as people make it out to be, and it shouldn't have been struck down as if it wouldn't have had a significant impact for many people already in college and those considering colleges in their future. Affirmative action was created in the 60s to address racial inequality and exclusion. Universities wanted to be seen as forward-thinking, but the implementation of many affirmative action policies were challenged. One such policy was the topic of debate in the regents of the University of California, Bach. Alan Bach argued that the school's affirmative action policy to reserve 16 out of the 100 seats for minority students was a violation of the Civil Rights Act. Now, the court ruled in his favor. However, Justice Powell acknowledged in his opinion that a state had legitimate interest in considering the race of applicants, and that a diverse student body could provide compelling educational benefits. Justice Powell's opinion cemented the court's position on affirmative action for decades, that race could be a tailored factor in admission policies, however racial quotas were not permitted. This was the court settling limits to ensure race-based admissions were not harming non-minority students, while still recognizing diversity and inclusion of various perspectives, and that it was in the state's interest. Essentially, Justice Powell's reasoning became a legal touchstone for many affirmative action decisions after. This case also highlighted a mass understanding about affirmative action, that affirmative action does not mean giving preference to one race or set of races above any other. It is about the issue of inequality, promoting diverse leadership, and ensuring a range of perspectives overall. The Supreme Court overturned the precedent of the Regents of the University of California, Bach, in the recent case of the Students for Fair Admissions, or SFFA, via the University of North Carolina and Carver. The decision in this case struck down affirmative action, meaning that universities could only consider race as long as it is concretely tied to the quality of character. Justice Clarence Thomas supported his opinion by saying that the law and the Constitution is colorblind. However, it is not as simple as that. The history of our nation is not as simple as that. Race is a contingent factor in many aspects of life, not just college admissions. However, given that college is seen as an opportunity for economic and personal growth, it is to be considered much more carefully. Colorblind college admissions tend to favor white students because of earlier and ongoing educational advantages. The issue of affirmative action also plays into wealth building and income inequality. And affirmative action ensures diversity and the inclusion of all perspectives.
So I don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to start with just talking about kind of general principles. So a policy proposal like affirmative action can be good on two different levels. It can be good morally, meaning it's good intrinsically, regardless of the effect it produces, or it can be good practically, meaning it actually does what it's intended to do. So dropping the atomic bomb might be an example of something that is dubious morally, but very good practically, in the sense that it did exactly what it was intended to do. Affirmative action is an interesting case because it is good neither practically nor morally, meaning there are negative moral implications of race-based or race preferential admissions, and affirmative action simply does not help the minority groups it's intended to help, and in fact, the research shows that it harms those minority groups. So let's start with the moral issue. The temptation to engage in racial discrimination has always come packaged with a justification that many found appealing at the time, like many of the justifications that Allison talked about. They do sound very appealing. But left-wing California Supreme Court Justice Stanley Mosk put it like this, quote, "To uphold the argument for race preferential admissions would call for the sacrifice of principle for the sake of dubious expediency." And the fact that the the fact that it's dubious is something that I want to stress. So, like I stated earlier, affirmative action policies don't actually help minority groups they're intended to help. And in fact, they often hurt them. So I can use a similar example to illustrate my point. Legacy students, which is a concept I'm sure you're all familiar with, students that are given preference in college admissions because they have family members that went to the university they're trying to get into. Legacy students have a higher dropout rate than other students. A study by Princeton researchers of about 4,000 students found that legacy students were more likely to drop out than non-legacy students. And I don't think it's a mystery why this is the case. If you're evaluating a candidate for a college and using a criteria that has nothing to do with their academic ability, they're going to struggle in college. This is true of equality like your dad going to the college you want to go to, and this is true of equality like race. Because the color of your skin does not in any way reflect your academic ability or your academic potential. And so what you have is students being put in a situation, being put in an academic situation that they are unprepared for, being mismatched in a college or university because they're being judged on criteria that has nothing to do with their academic ability, namely the color of their skin. An example of this can be seen at MIT, which is one of the top mathematics universities in America. Nearly 1/4 of black students fail to graduate from MIT. Is it because these students are bad at math? No. These students are in the 90th percentile nationwide in mathematics. The issue is that other MIT students are in the 99th percentile nationwide in mathematics. So these black students at MIT, who could be extremely successful in any number of great schools in this country and have an extremely successful career, are being forced to become artificial failures by being placed due to their race in a academic situation that doesn't match their academic credentials. And these practical and moral issues with affirmative action have led public opinion to change on this issue. A Pew Research Center report found that 74% of Americans think race and ethnicity should not be considered in college admissions decisions. And this majority opinion holds true across all racial groups and both political parties. So if you're interested, as I am, in helping students achieve academically, and especially if you're interested in helping minority students, race-based admissions or race preferential admissions are not yours.
We'll now go to our period of open forum. If you have questions, comments, concerns, things of that nature.
You brought up the point of legacy admissions. Today, the legacy applicant pools are largely white. However, legacy pools could grow more diverse in the coming decades due to increasing diversity within current classes, which can be attributed to affirmative action. Data taken from Harvard and MIT shows that MIT had a more diverse incoming class, and that while Harvard employs legacy consideration, MIT does not. Also, you brought up the point that some colleges, some universities, some even just admission policies may place race contingent students in there simply because of their race. However, I would like to remind people, MIT, Harvard, Ivy League schools, places like this, do not put people in colleges simply due to their race. They have a very strict application process. You have to meet a certain GPA, your test scores, everything. A person applying to a local community college is not going to be the same as a person applying to Harvard or MIT. These students are applying and getting in not just based on their race, but based on every single merit that is in their application. And I feel that is a massive misunderstanding about affirmative action.
That's a good point, and I'd actually like to address both of those points. I'll start with the first one. You talked about legacy admissions and how increasing legacy or affirmative action can lead to a more diverse pool of legacy admissions because more people going to these schools are racial minorities. And affirmative action seems to be very concerned with diverse incoming classes, not so much with diverse graduating classes, because affirmative action allows minority students to get into these higher universities, but as I mentioned, they're not graduating at the same grades as their non-minority peers, and that's because they're being mismatched with these universities. And there is no reason for minority students for talented, academically successful minority students to struggle at a university like MIT or Harvard when they could do excellently at a university like OU and not be made into artificial failures by these race preferential policies. So I'm not concerned with what percentage of incoming classes are racially diverse. I'm concerned with whether people are graduating or not. And to address your second point, yes, you mentioned that race is only one factor of many in admissions decision, which is of course true. They're not hiring, someone just because they're black, but it's this topic matters for a reason, and it is a factor, and that is the reason that I think at top universities, black students are failing and dropping out at higher rates than non-black students. That is the explanation I have. I don't think black students are just dumber than white students, or black students don't work as hard as white students. So I think we have to look at why that is. Why at Cornell, with such a high percentage of black students, nearly half, academic probation. Why at MIT, almost a quarter of black mathematics students be dropping out. And this is not true of non-minority students, right? Why could this be? I don't think it's because black students are worse, or perform worse academically, or aren't as smart. So the explanation I see is that they're being mismatched with a college, they're being mismatched with their university. And I would wonder if you don't think that's the explanation for poor minority performance in these high-level institutions. I wonder what you think the explanation would be.
I think that the suggestion that because minority students are not performing as well as these top universities, so they should just go to other universities, I don't think that is a good implication, because I believe that everyone, no matter who they are, can excel everywhere. That every race, every person, no matter who you are, has a place, whether at these top universities or anywhere else. And I think that the reason you're pointing out how all of these minority students are not doing as well at these top universities is because of their background as well. So, for example, community structure in the 60s were not kind to urban communities. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 constructed 41,000 miles of ambitious interstate highway systems, but it severely impacted urban communities, and specifically minority communities. The Department of Transportation estimates that more than 1 million people were displaced, and many speculate minority communities were targeted to segregate and isolate them. These highways, more importantly these communities, still exist today. This is just one example of many of the policies that were put in place to segregate and isolate minority communities, and they are still being affected today. Their economic growth, the wage gap, even just in Ohio, black people are earning 6 cents to every dollar white person. Hispanic or Latino people are earning 74 cents. This also goes into generational wealth. If there is still a wage gap today between races, imagine how it was in our parents' time or even our grandparents' time. Not the answer to these minority students struggling in upper education in places like Harvard, MIT. The answer is not just to tell them to apply to other places. It's to highlight the background in which they are coming from these places and try to affect change there as well. The Department of Transportation has recognized that the Federal Aid Highway Act was built on very unfortunate circumstances, and therefore they have pledged $1 billion to try to rebuild these communities that were affected by these highways, that were isolated and segregated by these highways.
I think to address that last point, there obviously are discrepancies in performance in terms of earnings, household income, and academic performance among different racial groups. However, I don't think that this is a result of government policy or negative racial discrimination and the against minority groups. And the evidence for that is that not all minority groups are struggling. In fact, in 2001, more than 16,000 Asian American students scored above 700 on the mathematics SAT, and fewer than 700 black students scored that high. Although there are several times more black students than Asian American students in the United States. This is a massive disparity, and Asian American students are much more successful academically than white students and make more money than white families. And the same is true of Indian American people, for example. So it's clear that these discrepancies that we talk about that are absolutely problematic are not a result of racial discrimination or government policy, but are a result of the individual cultures of each community. And this is evidenced by the fact that different minority groups have vastly different outcomes. And just to address your first point, you said the solution, if a minority student is struggling from Harvard, the solution is not to go to a university lower down the totem pole because everyone can succeed everywhere. And I don't think that's true. I don't think everyone can succeed everywhere. I know I would not make it at Harvard, and that's why I'm at OU. And I'm really struggling in finals right now. I wouldn't make it at Harvard. But if I got into Harvard because of the color of my skin and then dropped out because I couldn't handle the incredibly intense workload, I would be made into an artificial failure. Failing out of Harvard when I could have done perfectly well at a good school like OU. And that's really the issue that I'm trying to address here. It's not that these students can't succeed, but it is a fact. I wish it was true that everyone could succeed at a great university and everyone was cut out for Harvard education, but that's not true, and I know that because I'm not cut out for Harvard education. So I think it's important to recognize reality and do our best to address disparities at the cultural level rather than at the governmental level.
On your first point, the assumption that because one race is not struggling or even thriving, but other races aren't, is because there was no or fewer racial segregation. I believe that assumption is a bit flawed because we saw in the 50s and 60s a lot of racial discrimination, especially black people in this nation. And just because it is not nearly as frequent now doesn't mean that the effects still are not being felt today. Yes, Asian Americans do perform better, tend to perform better in universities. Does not mean that racial segregation and discrimination did not happen. It did still happen. And because of these facts that these minorities are still struggling on a more national scale, does not mean that we should ignore it. Does not mean that we should strike down affirmative action because it isn't working anymore. No, we should look more into why this is. We should look more into backgrounds, into how this is affecting them, and try to strike it there. Just because affirmative action has changed does not mean that it's not working anymore. And as to your second point, that not everyone would succeed at Harvard. I wouldn't succeed at Harvard. I know that. But these colleges still go through rigorous application processes. People are not getting in based on their race. People are getting in based on their test scores. Race is not even like how do I phrase this? So let's say we have two students. Both have the same GPA, both have the same test scores, both have almost everything similar. Their academics, their extracurriculars, everything like that. Even in a perfect world, race would not be a consideration when accepting one student over the other. However, this is not a perfect world. Factors like these, they build onto one another. They cannot be isolated. I think that assuming that these universities are taking these students simply based on their race and that is why they are failing is a bold assumption.
There absolutely has been racial discrimination in our country's history at the governmental level and at the level of university administration. And that absolutely had an impact on the success of minority groups. But the issue today is not further racial discrimination. Barack Obama agrees with me. He says, quote, "Go into any inner city neighborhood and folks will tell you that government alone can't teach kids to learn. They know that parents have to parent and children can't achieve unless we raise their expectations and turn off the television sets and eradicate the slander that says a black youth in the book is acting like." That's from Barack Obama's address to the Democratic National Convention. So, as Barack Obama says much better than I could, this is an issue not of race or racial discrimination, but of culture. There's a reason that a group that has experienced racial discrimination in our history, such as black people, are doing much worse than white people academically, and a group that has also experienced racial discrimination from our government, such as Asian Americans, is doing much better than white people academically. And that can't be because of racial discrimination, because that's a common factor in the vast economics. So the question is, what is the reason that there is this disparity? And I think you have to address it, as Barack Obama said, at the cultural level, rather than trying to make up for past injustices with present injustices.
What do you define as present injustice? I'm curious.
Sure. Basically, everything I discussed. I didn't even focus on issues that non-minority students can experience from affirmative action. I was just focused on the damage that affirmative action can do to the students who's purporting to help. So I think the mismatch between the student and institution is an injustice that I discussed, and the general failure of certain minority groups at the educational level due to affirmative action is an injustice. Although it's under the name of social justice, it is an injustice. And that doesn't even speak of students who are not minorities that have had opportunities denied because of the color of their skin and because they don't fall into a group that's viewed to be victimized. So those are the injustices that I was referring to.
What would you blame these injustices on?
I would blame those injustices on race preferential policies that say that someone's skin color matters, period, to their ability to perform academically or their ability to succeed in the workplace. I think the answer is to view people by kind of their character. When you're looking at college admissions, why don't we look at, focus primarily, totally on things like grades and extracurriculars and standardized test scores, and really anything at all that accurately or in any way reflects someone's ability to succeed at the university level. I don't think the color of someone's skin in any way determines their ability to succeed academically.
I had a 3.8 GPA coming into ONU. I did not take the ACT or the SAT. I did take the ACT. But no matter what my credentials said, no matter what my extracurriculars said, no one could have predicted my future here at ONU. Even I couldn't. Sure, I'm doing well. Sure, that attributes to, in somewhat, my background in high school. However, I believe that you're basing your assumption that these minority students are failing out at more rates just due to affirmative action and placing them there is a bit of speculation. Because like you said, these colleges should be basing their acceptance rates on students are not getting in just based on their race. They're getting in entirely based on their background. Now, you also pointed out how there could be correlation between the fact that minority students are failing out in affirmative action. But the answer shouldn't be telling them to go to a different course. The answer should be locating the problem as to why this is, and if it's affirmative action, not getting rid of it, then restructuring it, giving people a platform to either bring them wider success or just restructuring affirmative action in the first place. Striking it down and seeing what the consequences are decades down the line, I don't think that's the right policy here. Because some of these minority students are still being affected, are still not able to go to places they want to go based on some of the factors, like the Highway Act that I talked about. How decades worth of racial segregation in the past are still affecting you today. And affirmative action is trying to tackle some of these problems, and I don't think that striking it down is very good. Some of the points you brought up are absolutely valid. How some of these minority students are failing out at a greater rate, but striking down affirmative action is not the answer to all that. It is restructuring, and it is focusing on identifying why this is and how we can solve it.
So to address your first point, I don't know where I'm time.
One.
Okay, I'll finish up. To just address your first point quickly before we wrap up, you mentioned that prestigious schools like MIT or Harvard, 3% acceptance rates. Students are not being let in just because they lack. They're being test scores and things that are actually relevant to academic ability are being looked at, of course, and I completely agree with that. And these students, black students that are admitted because of affirmative action policies to MIT and Harvard are extremely successful students. And that is why it's such a travesty that they are being made into artificial failures. Because, like I said, at MIT, the black students at MIT that are dropping out at much higher rates than non-minority groups are in the 90th percentile of mathematics in the nation. These are successful students, but they're failing at MIT. I think it is better to succeed at a university slightly down the road than to fail at a higher university. Like I talked about, I don't care how many black students are getting into MIT. I want to know if people are succeeding and graduating. So, like I said, affirmative action, like you mentioned actually at the beginning of your speech, talks about how universities want to be seen as forward thinking. They want to make a change. They want to help these minority students, which I think is a laudable goal. But affirmative action is simply not working at helping these minority students succeed academically. And so I think other means of helping them need to be discovered and looked at.
I feel like I, again, cannot predict the future anyway. However, saying that these minority students could succeed at other places, maybe they could. But what does that leave these colleges with? MIT, Harvard. Does that leave them with a less diverse population in the end? And that's not a good thing. Diversity, inclusion of all perspectives is a very important thing to consider. And just saying that because these minority students are not succeeding as well as they can be at other places does not mean that the diversity at these colleges and campuses should be ignored.
Both very much. That concludes our time discussing affirmative action. Our last topic for this evening is discussing transgender in sports. So please welcome Michael Kirchner and Wesley Carter to the stage. question for this evening is, should college athletics be separated by biological sex or gender identity?
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. First, I'm going to list a few names. You may have heard them, you may have not, but just to get you thinking. Riley Gaines, Chelsea Mitchell, Paige Onweller, Suzanne Gill, and Peyton McNabb. What do all of these women have in common? They are just a few of the biological women who have been wronged. Just a few of the biological women who, while competing, whether high school, college, or beyond, were stripped of the opportunity to compete on a fair and equal playing field. One of which was so violently struck in the head when a transgender woman, or biological male, spiked the volleyball, leaving her with a head and neck injury that caused her to have partial paralysis on her right side and vision impairment. Today, in the realm of collegiate sports and all levels of competition, the division is between biological sex and gender identity. It is imperative to recognize the fundamental biological differences between male and female athletes and to uphold fairness, integrity, and safety with competitive sports. It's not about discrimination against transgender athletes. It's about preserving the integrity of women's sports and ensuring that female athletes have a level playing field to showcase their talents and abilities. Women's sports have historically faced barriers and discrimination, and creating opportunities for female athletes to excel has been a hard-fought battle. Allowing biological males to compete in women's sports could diminish these hard-won opportunities for female athletes, potentially discouraging their participation and undermining the progress made in women's athletics. Respecting the right of transgender athletes, while essential, should not come at the expense of the rights of female athletes. It must be balanced so that all athletes can compete on a fair and equal playing field. Now let's look at the science. The science shows being born a man gives you the advantage of being faster, stronger, and more powerful than females. One of the many factors that contribute to this is testosterone. Men have 15 times the amount of circulating testosterone than women at any age. The amount of testosterone in men contributes to their bone density, their body fat distribution, their body height, their longer limbs, their larger lung capacity, and muscle growth and strength. This greater muscle bulk that comes with the amount of testosterone men have allows them to generate greater force, speed, and energy than women. In conclusion, the division of college sports by biological sex rather than gender identity is not about exclusion or discrimination. It's about safeguarding the essence of fair competition and ensuring that every athlete, regardless of gender, has the opportunity to thrive in an environment that respects their physical capabilities and upholds the principles of equity and fairness. I hope that by the end of this conversation between my counterpart and I, you will trust the science and realize that collegiate sports should be divided by biological sex, as that is how we can continue to uphold fairness, integrity, and safety for all in competitive sports.
Okay, thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Northern View staff. They've put a lot of work into this. This has been months in the making. We did it last year. We started to do it again. And they're a little bit short-staffed, and I just want to appreciate that. I want to thank you all for being here. When I was approaching this kind of question, I obviously am not a female. I am not an athlete. I'm not any of those things. So I kind of had to approach it with what I've got, right? And I kind of just said, what are the options that we have for how to kind of do this kind of system, and what exactly are we valuing? And many of the values that I identified and we identified in our research were pretty similar to what you have, kind of fairness, safety, and kind of a fair opportunity kind of thing. We were very much interested in like, what kind of options do we have? And I'll be honest, I went, got a whiteboard in Hill 200, best room on campus. Love Hill, that's where we got these seats from, God appreciate that. And we were writing out these options and we're like, okay, what if we did sex assigned by at birth only? What if we did gender only? What if we did biological sex is like a transition period for people that are trans. What if we did an open division, like no distinction at all, everyone's the same thing? What if we said, hey, NCAA, that's so big, we need to accommodate more people, it might be better to do it at like a state-by-state level, something like that. What if we banned all trans people from schools? Like, just get everything on the table, and like the last one was like, what if we just had like a men's category and then like another category, or everyone else and then one special category? And I think each of these options has various pros and cons, right? And when I'm looking at the proposal here of doing it just by sex, there are some very clear problems there, as all these have. But I think out of all these options here, I think it might be among the worst, maybe not the worst, but it's not great. And I do agree that it may help with fairness for women, which is good. But there, even just by sex, there are some issues, and one of them could be the existence of trans men. A lot of the discourse so far, online, in person, and or here, is very much focused on trans women in schools. But I do want to recognize that trans men do exist, and they also could have significant advantages or disadvantages. I've not looked too much into the science on that because it is admittedly like a rare thing, but there is still kind of concern when we are trying to create a policy that you could have advantages or disadvantages there. And there's also people that have kind of abnormal or kind of different sexual characteristics. Like, you can look at women's sports and find people that were assigned women at birth, or cis women, whatever term you want to use. And some of them have naturally high testosterone levels. They weren't born a man in transition or anything like that. They just have higher testosterone. So I think there's kind of a problem if we are doing the distinction purely by testosterone that would not really account for. So I think whatever process it is, it will be messy. Now, the problem with doing it just with sex is not only that kind of messy issue, but also that you're kind of excluding a lot of trans people, right? Which is a pretty big issue for me, at least. It's just that, like you mentioned, there was a struggle for women's rights, and I think that the struggle for trans rights and LGBTQ rights, who we only had the gay marriage thing only for a couple of years here, I think they have to fight for their own representation as well, and I think that we can find a better policy that helps everyone get what we want, which is equality, opportunity, fairness, safety, stuff like that.
Now the floor is open for general comments, concerns, questions, things of that nature. So let's start.
I guess my first question for you would be, what out of the options you listed do you think is the best choice?
Yeah.
That you would choose?
Okay. Yeah. Honestly, I don't like most of them. I think it's clear every single one of them has problems. And looking at them, I think probably the most viable would be to do a transition period, which I think is already the case in some leagues. Of course, sport by sport, there are people trying to figure out the standards as we speak, I would imagine. So they could say, hey, you have to be on HRT or some hormone replacement therapy, some kind of transition process for 6 months, could be as long as 2 years, could be longer. I'm not going to make a claim that I know that process, but I think that there is a way that we can figure out a way to make it fair and inclusive and try to do that, which I don't think doing it purely by sex would do, nor doing an open category or stuff like that would do. So, what do you think about like the transition period?
I think my problem with the transition period is that it has been tried, and for example, Leah Thomas, they went through a 1-year transition period, and the statistics that were shown is that in general, men have about 11%, I guess, average time above women in the swimming NCAA categories, and with Leah being on I just don't think because of how biologically, as a male, she had, like, she was automatically born with all the testosterone that women do not have. Like, I don't think that it's possible to completely delineate all of the testosterone, and I just have a feeling that, as we've seen already, more and more trans women would start taking the place of biological women who have worked their whole lives in that space.
Yeah, I understand that. And there are a lot of physical attributes that do affect sports that, to me, are a little bit unfair, right? Like, if you watch the NFL draft, they have like a relative athletic score. And a lot of those traits are things that you cannot control. You can't really control your height, you can't control your wingspan. And like, I remember I was watching the draft last night and they're like, this guy, he might be a bad offensive guard or an offensive tackle. He only has 43-inch arms or something like that, as opposed to 44 or 45. And I do recognize that these physical things are like huge in sports. But I think there is also the case that there are abnormalities that exist and that are acceptable. Like, if you go to men's swimming, Michael Phelps had an abnormally large wingspan, and that's probably part of the reason he was great, right? Independent of his skill, which he personally kind of have. I'm not a swimmer, I don't really know. But there is, I agree, like a huge amount of impact that physical traits have, and it could be the case that they can be factored out. Some cases it may not be. And I think that the best way to do that is to really go through an evidentiary process rather than shutting it down at sex full stop. There needs to be a good search for alternatives that can be factored that in. Now, there are some proposals that like, hey, what if we just cut at this amount of testosterone, that kind of thing. And I don't think they really would work because like there's a lot of different factors going on, and once you have that many distinctions, then really, what do I watch? Yeah, there's a lot of different things going on there that I agree that it should be a relatively simple process, but I think, yeah, that testosterone might not be the good thing that women do have testosterone naturally occurring, men of course have significantly more, and when they do the transition, they usually lower the testosterone and replace it with other hormones and stuff. But yeah, I think there's nuance there that a scientific process and approach that may take a couple of years would probably be the best. Now, there's friction, but we can deal with that as a society, and sports do adapt. If you watch baseball, there's kind of this thing where everyone is throwing 100 miles an hour, right? Everyone is trying to throw as hard as they can. Then you have all these injuries happen. And each team is like looking at that and they're like, do we want to be having everyone throw fastballs? And then they kind of adjust. And maybe in the next couple of years they'll have people go by technique and not by velocity.
How would you feel about a trans category?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about that when I was thinking like open division versus like have like a special women's category, something like that. And I think the main issue with that is that there's, insofar as like college is a competitive thing, there's scholarships on the line, there's viewership on the line, that kind of thing, especially with professional sports. I'm wondering, just because there's not many trans people, if they're a very small minority, whether or not that would be viable, as opposed to just try to figure out how to fit them with others, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I would tend to agree it is a very small minority right now, but I just like looking at the, I guess, inclusion, well, not really trend, that's how I feel like, but looking at the inclusion perspective, if they tended to feel more welcome with people who are like them, then I feel like maybe if we were able to get a trans category, more people would come forward to compete as well. If that makes sense?
Yeah, I can see there being more people do that, but we are at like an interesting stage in history where like a lot of the procedures and stuff are significantly more safer than they were in the past. So I imagine that now that the treatment is much easier to get, now it's way harder than in others, that there will be, like, you don't really know the absolute, like, prevalence of the amount of trans people that will exist. And there's kind of social stuff there that is still being figured out, like medicine, detransition rates. We don't know all that stuff yet, and we probably won't know for a couple of decades, I would imagine. So yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff where we have to really take time to figure out, and there will be like a messy transitional period that will exist if we go what I'm proposing of like a transition period. And I think that's acceptable if we get a better solution through that friction and tension, that's the scientific method, rather than rush a hasty decision of cutting people off with a bad decision in a more expedient process.
When you say cutting people off, what are you referring to?
I mean, like, people that transition just not being able to, like, at all, right? Just full stop, not being allowed to with, like, women or whatever. I think it's fine to have some friction there where maybe there will be some unfairness, and that will lead to further questions and further investigation. I think that this process needs to take place, and gradually different leagues and stuff will gradually adapt, and the athletes, I would assume, would also adapt to do that.
Okay, what I'm about to say, I probably don't agree with completely, but
Love
say,
that
say we don't have a messy transition period, so we keep it by biological sex while they're trying to figure out how to complete the transition in a way that it would be fair for them to finally compete against the sex of their gender identity. Would you be okay with that?
Yeah, so basically instead of doing a transition period, it's kind of like a science experiment before our very eyes, do like a separate, like, or like have trans women not compete with women for a small period. I think there is some good points to that, but I think there's a general concept that like representation matters for people, right? That people should be able to see models of themselves out in the media such that they can aspire to be that as well, right? And I fear that if we completely cut it off, there would be less opportunities for representation, which I think is so valuable, especially like women's rights movements. It's good to see, like if you were in like the 60s or in the past, if you're a woman then, seeing people that in more successful places, like I want to say like, remember like was McCarthyism, one of the people mainly shut down was a woman, and that was like the first female senator in Congress. And I think that having role models like that happen was not only instrumental for the women's movement, but also for this new movement of people. And yeah, I think that I would be more fine with the kind of rough transition period than like harming people temporarily or something like that. Yeah, so what do you think just generally about that idea now I've kind of had some clarification there?
Yeah, think that I think that the best way to go about this still is to be divided by biological sex. I think with your point that you made about how people want to see themselves being represented, we're not like throwing them in a corner, if that makes sense. Like they're still allowed to compete as who they want to be just with their biological sex. So if they were to go and win in the male category, they would still be reported to the media as the trans woman who won in that male category. Like, so there's still going to be people looking up to them and seeing them portrayed and how they want to be portrayed, and people like following in that aspect.
Yeah, the one kind of issue though would be that they would be, trans women competing with men, but that might be uncomfortable for people watching because they want to see people who go through the transition and are accepted, right? Because that's like kind of a huge thing when it comes to like, I don't want to say what's phenomenological, but like the lived experience of many of these people is that it feels as if they want to be accepted and feel accepted. And I'm not sure, of course, since I haven't had that experience, if you would get the same feeling of representation if you are still not accepted as who you believe yourself to be, or who the person you're watching accepts themselves to be.
No, that makes sense. And I mean, to go off that, like, I think just if we were like to continue allowing men to compete with women, like women are also getting uncomfortable. Biological women are uncomfortable with changing in front of transgender women. They're uncomfortable competing with them because of the things that have occurred. So I guess going off of both of those points that we made, like I think biological sex is still the best outcome for now, and in the future, I think the best outcome would be to have a trans category. But right now, it is not plausible because it's not enough of them. But if we're talking about fairness and comparability and keeping things competitive and everyone's able to showcase off their own talents, like men and women biologically need to be separated.
I want to make one kind of last analogy as far as like the transition period. I think any policy that especially has major social ramifications is going to be very messy, and I think we can look no further than baseball, which I've already referenced once. When we had, of course, Negro Leagues and the MLB, and for a long time banned black people from playing, I feel like there was not the same kind of representation. It doesn't mean as much to win the MVP of the Negro League when that existed versus now having the right after having Jackie Robinson go and do amazing things in the MLB. I feel like the uncomfortableness that happens is still worth it, right? Like there was still the tension. Jackie Robinson went through hell, right? He was attacked by people, spit on, got unfair treatment and stuff like that. And I think in the end, it was worth it to go through that because he, in the process, showed that he belonged, people gained the respect and the acceptance of him. And we're talking about trans people as a category. They often do feel kind of like excluded in society, and I feel like it is important to show that they can be integrated in the way that they want to in the future, that kind of thing.
Just moving a little bit, how do you guys feel about transgender competing instead of exclusively in a male or female category, but in many professional sports, tennis, swimming, all the track sports, just to name a few, have mixed categories, so mixed relays, mixed doubles, things of that nature, in tournament style, things like that, rather than exclusively to a biological sex category.
Yeah, I think that, especially sports, since there is a huge biological component, I think it is fair to go on a very sport-by-sport basis. Like there are some sports that the parity or the difference between men and women is not that large, and in which case you don't need, it would be more fun to do mixed categories. But I think that in general, the approach that should be taken towards this whole process should be as much following evidence as possible, and trying to make sure that we include everyone, consider all of these values that we have, such as equity, fairness, opportunity, stuff like that. And mixed categories, I feel like are a pretty good way to do it, but I feel like I would not want to restrict just to those categories. I think there needs to be some friction and stuff like that in the other, in the main categories and stuff like that.
So, I think that having mixed gender leagues to allow trans people to compete in would be just fine. Actually, the
good, and I think we should have that kind of decided on a sport by sport basis. I think the general approach kind of to how these decisions have been made should be kind of league by league. I think that gradually the stakeholders that are going to be affected should be the people listened to. The women affected, the athletes, the coaches, the leagues, the fans, the donors, all those people should have a voice in that process. And the one thing I fear, especially looking around the country at different legislatures, is that it's the legislators that are often making the decision that we should exclude people from all these sports. And I think that we should make clear that the process should be with the stakeholders and people that are involved with these things. Maybe not people like me who are here opining as a philosopher or whatever. But yeah.
I think we need to make clear that we're not excluding them. They're still allowed to play. They're just going to play on the playing field that is fair for them to play on, so that they're not taking away opportunities from the other candidate.
Go broader to how sports are integrated in
One thing I would kind of like to address is kind of just, and this is something that I don't really have a full perspective on, but maybe something to just ask about. The new NIL deals have vastly changed the college landscape. I'm obviously not someone, but do you think that maybe the NIL deals kind of in any way shift your perspective on any of this question?
No, I don't think NIL deals shift my perspective on this question, because the NIL deals are still heavily given to men, biological men, just because the sports that are heavily watched, basketball, football. There was a couple of women in the top 10 college athletes paid because of their NIL deals, but I don't think it would shift my perspective on sports being divided by biological sex, because if we allow trans women to compete in women's sports, I don't think that would affect the NIL deals coming over to women's sports. I think they would still be going to men's sports.
Yeah, the one thing I can see it kind of affecting is just maybe the nature of the sport and I guess what people are trying to get out of it. So when I initially think, hey, what are college sports about? They're about character development, virtue, they're about camaraderie and community. And to me, the NIL stuff makes it much more about competition and winning and stuff like that. That the winners get the money, and that's kind of a general theme that I've been kind of thinking about when studying this, is just the effect that maybe the commercialization of collegiate sports kind of has. And I feel like if we took the excitement level of college sports down a notch, right, I feel like we would not have as heated of discourse around this. Of course, this is great, but when I look on the media, it's very heated, and that's mainly because there's so much money at stake, so much investment. We have such a huge spectacle and everything.
Yeah, I think it would still be heated even if we took college sports down a notch, because this is what people work for all their lives if they're going to play at a D1 level school. I started playing tennis in high school, and my first match was against a guy, and thankfully he had just started too, so it wasn't like I was playing some freshman in college who played for 6 years. But when I went to a D1 school to play, I wouldn't be learning anything. I wouldn't be developing anything from that. I would just be feeling defeat of everything that I went through. So I think if we kept it by biological sex, everyone would still be getting the character development that they would want from that. Everyone would still be learning the lessons of team communication and just working together. And everyone would still have their opportunities.
We are unfortunately out of time.